Instead, far too many of our politicians come to Washington to stay. Too much of Washington's business is dictated by career politicians, by bureaucrats, and by lobbyists who spend time as one or the other. The rise of political careerism in modern Washington is a sharp departure from what the founders intended in our federal governing bodies, to effectively drain the swamp and to end the phenomenon of career politicians. It is long past time to enact term limits for Congress. I am the author of a constitutional amendment that would limit U.S. senators to 2 6-year terms and would limit members of the House of Representatives to 3 2-year terms. At this point, we currently have 14 co-sponsors in the Senate. It is my hope that this hearing today will help explain why we should come together, Republicans and Democrats across party lines, to enact term limits to protect the American people. The Senate, I believe, should take up and vote on the term limits amendment that I've introduced. And if Congress will simply listen to the American people, to the overwhelming majorities across party lines that want to see term limits, which we have for the president, see term limits also for Congress, then we can rest confidence that the states would quickly ratify that amendment. The only impediment is the United States Congress, and I hope that this hearing and the panel that we have to get to today, the 2 panels, will help move that discussion forward. With that, I recognize Senator Hirono for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for coming this afternoon to discuss whether or not congressional term limits are an effective way to improve our government. I know Senator Cruz believes that term limits would help solve the problems we have with corruption, cronyism, and accountability in Congress. But there are better and easier ways, and I would say more effective ways, to connect the government more directly and honestly to the people. In my view, the most effective term limits are elections, and the most knowledgeable term limiters are voters. To strengthen voting, this constitutional mechanism of accountability, we should be working to ensure more Americans are able to vote by making voting easier in the United States, not harder, by making voter registration as simple as possible, by stopping unnecessary and discriminatory purging of voter rolls, by making it easier for people to vote early or allow them to vote by mail. I'd say that if the American people were asked whether they support the aforementioned points, probably we'd find that a vast majority would support these suggestions. But Congress is not acting to do any of those things. We should all condemn discriminatory voter ID laws, partisan gerrymandering, and we should enact a law to reverse the Shelby County decision. We should also admit that there is no crisis of voter fraud, and instead counter the real problems of election fraud, like we saw in North Carolina, and election security. We should pass any of the very sound bills proposed by my colleagues that would require reporting of offers of foreign election interference, secure election systems, and require paper ballots. We don't need to artificially restrict voters' choices. Instead, we should expand voting access and opportunities. The more eligible Americans who vote in every election, the better. Full stop. Our concerns about corruption can be tackled by improving ethics rules and procedures. Let's make sure that there's more reporting and transparency, not just in Congress, but across all branches of government. If what we want is more confidence in elected officials, let's make it easier for voters to trust us. Anyone elected to public office in this country, or even appointed to high positions of trust like the cabinet, should have to prove to the public that their only interest is the public interest. We should all have to divest ourselves of any private business interests, from small peanut farms to large multinational branding companies to anything in between. We should not be able to profit from our public service once we are finished with it either. If, for example, you served as head of a department making decisions about detaining immigrants, like former Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly, you should not be allowed immediately to go through a revolving door and get paid by a corporation building those detention facilities. Former members of Congress should not have floor privileges if they use them to lobby clients. No wonder elected officials have problems with public trust. We do not police ourselves effectively. A final thing I'd like to highlight is a mechanism for improving government that's right there in our Constitution as the first of the Bill of Rights. I'm talking about freedom of the press. If we want to make our elected officials more accountable, we should all support the rights of a free press. Because no matter how good voter turnout is, no matter how safe our election systems are, no matter how transparent members of Congress are about our conflicts, as Justice Louis Brandeis wrote, quote, "Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, electric light the most efficient policeman," end quote. Instead of calling the free press the enemy of the people and cutting off their access to what the people's government is doing, we need to champion the role they play in our democracy and increase transparency. The more informed voters are, the better their choices will be, and the more responsive our government will become. So while I agree with Senator Cruz that Congress and government as a whole owes our voters more than they are getting now, I don't agree that term limits is the answer. In the testing ground of state governments, term limits have served to strengthen the executive branch at the expense of legislatures. They make lobbyists more, not less, influential, and they restrict voters' choices. I do look forward to hearing more details from our witnesses on both sides of the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. We'll now introduce our first witness, the Honorable Jim DeMint, former senator from South Carolina, chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute, and a longtime friend to many of us on this committee. Senator DeMint served the American people in both houses of Congress. From 1999 to 2005, he represented South Carolina's 4th District, and from 2007 to 2013, he represented the state of South Carolina in the United States Senate, where he authored leading conservative reforms to health care, to education, taxes, and entitlements. Among his many achievements, Senator DeMint led conservative efforts to ban congressional earmarks, something that the Republican conference this year made a permanent ban within our conference. Most relevant to today's hearing, Senator DeMint led an effort to impose term limits on members of the House and Senate, ultimately taking a resolution that would have expressed the sense of the Senate that the Constitution ought to be amended to include term limits to the floor of the Senate. At the conclusion of his service in the Senate, Senator DeMint became the president of the Heritage Foundation, working there for 4 years. Senator DeMint is currently the chairman of the Conservative Policy Institute, and he is also the founder of the Senate Conservatives Fund. Senator DeMint is the author of several books, including Now or Never, Saving America from Economic Collapse, The Great American Awakening, 2 Years That Changed America, Saving Freedom, We Can Stop America's Slide into Socialism, and most recently, Falling in Love with America Again, which debuted at number 1 on the Washington Post bestseller list. Senator DeMint, welcome, and I would ask that you stand and be sworn in. You'd raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, former colleagues on the subcommittee. It's extremely gracious of you to invite me today, especially considering I'm going to spend my time advocating for your unemployment. It's nothing personal, I promise. I get the opportunity to travel all over the country and speak to a lot of groups, and I find there are many issues where the opinions of the American people and Congress are divergent. But there are few issues where that gap is as large as the issue of term limits. If you need a standing applause line, it's talk about term limits, and people will stand up and applaud. As Mr. Chairman, you've already pointed out, somewhere between 75–80% of Americans believe in term limits, not only for congressmen and senators, but they sure like the idea of judges and bureaucrats because they instinctively know what is an eternal truth, that power corrupts And in Washington, seniority is closely associated with power. There are good arguments for and against congressional term limits, and these are roughly the same arguments that delegates debated at the Constitutional Convention. It was George Mason of Virginia who argued that nothing is so essential to the preservation of a Republican government as a periodic rotation of its representatives. For his part, Rufus King of New York insisted that he who has proved himself to be most fit for an office ought not to be excluded by the Constitution from holding it. In theory, both are right. A governmental turnover is undeniably healthy for any republic, especially for one as large and diverse as we are. Meanwhile, disqualifying unusually capable legislators from serving would be a definite loss to our country. The philosophical argument about term limits can be a close call, as it was in 1787. Unlike our founders, however, we don't have to confine our debate to theoretical abstractions. We can draw on real-world experience with our 230-year-old system, and especially its performance over the last few decades. And the practical case for term limits, Mr. Chairman, is no longer a close call. We do not have to speculate, as the founders did, that the prospect of a permanent tenure in Congress might tempt senators and representatives towards self-interested, short-term thinking. We know for a fact, especially in recent decades when control of Congress has been constantly up for grabs, this short-term thinking has become Congress's defining defect. For individual members, short-term thinking warps incentives towards bringing home the bacon and fundraising, and to the special interest who can deliver them both. Members spend less time legislating and more time raising money, both for their own re-elections and for the political action committees specifically designed to finance their careerist ambitions. And members quickly give up their campaign promises of bold ideas such as balancing the budget and turn to new programs spending more money that they can deliver to their constituents. As individual members have retreated from their legislative responsibilities, party leaders have, however poorly, filled the gap. Given their incentives, leaders now use the House and Senate not as legislative institutions, but as arms of their party's campaign committees. The Senate, in particular, no longer functions as a legislative body at all. Leaders of both parties have shut down deliberative floor debate and amendment votes for the sole purpose of shielding senators from politically controversial votes, thereby denying the American people's right to an accountable legislature. Members who criticize this dysfunctional shirts versus skins approach are chastised for not being team players and threatened with being cut off from their party leader's special interest fundraising gravy train. Conscious, burdened senators and representatives are reassured that this process, however imperfect, is simply how they make their way in Washington. But in truth, it's how Washington makes its way into them. Lifelong tenure incentivizes members to prioritize the next election over the next generation and partisanship over statesmanship. It realigns their interest away from the American people and towards the swamp. The consequences are all around us. The $22 trillion national debt, the wasteful pork barrel programs appropriated specifically to facilitate members' reelection, the unreformed entitlement programs that both parties know are hurling the nation into insolvency, Congress's lack of oversight over the sprawling federal bureaucracy, the power of special interest, particularly the corrupt allure of a lucrative post-congressional career on K Street for members who play ball, the total disappearance of the budget process, the breakdown of the legislative process, especially in the Senate, the mindless partisanship, the collapse of public confidence in Congress as an institution. Now, I know term limits would not solve all of these problems, but they would significantly change incentives throughout the political system. In Washington, fundraising would become less important, and so special interests would be less powerful, and partisanship less personally or politically rewarding. Term limits might open up space and maybe even provide a little courage towards action on politically difficult issues like entitlement reform, health care, immigration, and budget reform. By closing off avenues to be something important, term limits might reintroduce senators and representatives to the appeal of doing something important for their constituents, for their country, and for themselves. The end result would be more accountable, more statesmanlike, and in time, a more trusted and respected Congress. Mr. Chairman, as I said before, our Congress is on an unsustainable course. We do have the $22 trillion debt, near $1 trillion annual deficits. The trust funds for Social Security and Medicare have been spent on other things. The transportation fund is empty, and we could go on and on. That's why when I ran for Congress, I limited my own term, consistent with your amendment of 6 years in the House and 2 in the Senate, hoping to get the freedom to rock the boat, to challenge the system, to try to change this unsustainable course where one that we can actually build a better America. And I'm grateful for you for introducing it. I am very well aware of all the arguments on both sides. But when I came to Congress, I supported term limits in theory. Now I support it after seeing what really happens here. And we know, as I said before, that power corrupts, and it has corrupted absolutely here in Washington, and it's the seniority system that drives it all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will entertain any questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Senator DeMint, for your powerful testimony. I will say something you said at the tail end there is actually something I found myself saying many times when I'm back in Texas, which is before I was elected to the Senate, I supported term limits. But having now served here, having seen it firsthand, I support term limits 1,000 times more. You've served in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Can you share from your own experience what serving in Congress, why that led you to support term limits, why it underscored the need for a limit on the terms?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believed coming in as a businessman who've never been involved in politics of the idea of citizen statesmen, of folks coming to Washington and representing their constituents for a limited period and then coming back and living under the laws that they passed. I did find a lot, if you limit your own term under the current situation, you are at a disadvantage. I was denied committees, a number of things. I was told right away if I wanted to raise money in Washington, I need to disavow my pledge. It's certainly not a welcomed thing here in Washington. But as I said before, the most important thing to me was not to become a part of the problem that I ran for Congress to get rid of. And that was the entrenched political establishment that was vested in the status quo, careening our country towards really bankruptcy and a lot of other things that bothered me. I felt term limits would give me the freedom to come, rock the boat, fight the system, and not feel like I had to have my eyes on the prize of a committee or a chairmanship or eventually to be in leadership. And I knew limiting my term and especially rocking the boat that none of those were going to come my way. And I think it is true. My perspective was always different. I always said if you're going to run a race and you know it's 100 yards, you can give it your all. And I did that in the House and the Senate. But if you're just going out jogging for a ways, you can do it for a long, long time. And you don't really reach a destination in the same way you did. So, again, I've heard the arguments, Mr. Chairman, that, we'll have a permanent staff, we'll have a permanent bureaucracy, that elections are the best term limits. But we know the power of incumbency. We know what's happened to preserve the seniority system, and it's way beyond what it was when I got here. And the only way to limit terms were the way we did it for the President of the United States, and that's to put it in the Constitution.
In your testimony, you talked about incentives. It's been my observation that the dominant incentive in the United States Senate, and for that matter in the House, is risk aversion. I've been at numerous town halls back home in Texas where citizens will ask, they'll say, do members of Congress, do they believe anything? Are they just, did they believe anything when they first ran? And what I usually share with folks is I said, look, I think most people who run for Congress, they do so because they do believe in some principles. On the Democratic side, on the Republican side, they come here with an idea of changing things. But then the incentives become the overwhelming, dominant desire is I must get reelected. And that dwarfs anything else, and they find themselves, it's a little bit like the wonderful movie series The Godfather, where in each of those movies is the story of Michael Corleone, the good son, making decisions, each of which seems in its own perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational. Michael steps forward to save his father. His father's going to be murdered. But each of those small rationalization leads him down the road to becoming a mass murderer. In much the same way, I think elected members of Congress, they make small concessions to, well, I want to do something big. I want to balance the budget. I want to address the debt. I want to strengthen and reform Social Security and Medicare, but I got to get reelected first. And it's those series of small concessions, one after the other, that they find, and I think this is true on both sides of the aisle. You look at both Republicans and Democrats who are afraid to work together in a bipartisan manner because the overwhelming objective is we must get reelected. Mm-hmm. Do those observations, does that comport with what you saw when you served here and what you see as an informed observer today?
Yes, they do, but I don't think either one of us want to suggest that our unterm limited colleagues are mass murderers, Mr. Chairman. And so I wouldn't want to associate with that, and I know that's not what you meant. What I have observed is that everyone, Republican and Democrat, comes here with good intentions and a lot of bold ideas to change, but it usually comes to change the system. We find very quickly that there is no reward for changing something. There's particularly no reward for cutting anything, eliminating any program, or cutting spending. All the rewards here in Washington are for growing government, spending more money, and creating more programs and protecting the status quo. I have seen, again, that people come with a lot of good intentions, but there are very few, I could probably count them on one hand, out of the more than 500 congressmen and senators who have been here more than 10 years, who are still really fighting for those things they came for. And I think that should just tell us something on its face, that this place, this town, this swamp, changes the whole alignment from what we come for and what we end up doing. It's just bigger than we are as individuals. Term limits would allow folks to keep their focus back home on what they're going to do after Congress. It would make sure that they did everything they can before the next election to accomplish their goals, rather than what we see here time and time again. Just like I read in the news today, there will be no consideration of health reform until after the next election. And I heard that so many times, Mr. Chairman, DeMint, this is not the right time or the right way to do this. You need to wait. And again, I'm not suggesting this is going to solve all our problems. The ranking member has mentioned other things that we can do. So this is not a silver bullet, but this is one that will fundamentally change incentives and align what we do here with, I think, our founders' vision of citizen statesmen representing the American people.
Although I might be obliged to say that Mo Green was a friend of mine, I will take your friendly amendment that at least the overwhelming majority of members of Congress are not currently mass murderers.
Okay.
With that, Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note that the chairman noted that members of Congress are very risk averse and that the only thing they care about is re-elections, and therefore they are risk averse. But I have to note that, for example, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, that was a huge change to our health care laws. There were people in Congress who lost their elections, re-elections, because they voted for the ACA. I would hardly call that risk averse. Or when the Senate passed the Comprehensive Immigration Law Act, which sadly the Republican-controlled House did not act upon, that was a huge risk-taking move on the part of the Senate. Or I have to say, when we voted on Judge Kavanaugh to become a lifetime justice on the Supreme Court, you had 3 members of the Senate who voted against him, knowing full well that their reelection was going to be hurt, and in fact, they lost their election. So I hardly think that, that kind of broad statement does us much good, in my opinion. Now, Senator, were you aware that since 2013, the average time of senators has been 10.2 years, and that the average term of House members is 9.1 years? And then among the 116th Congress, that the average term of senators is only 10.6 years? Did you know that?
Yes, it did.
So even without term limits, people are not staying the kind of, forever as you postulate. So I just put that in also for the record.
May I comment?
Well, are you disputing the amount of
No,
time
just
that
a
senators and House
perspective
members
there.
stay?
I found that lots of new members come and go, and folks serve for a shorter time. Just after the great 2010 Tea Party, lots of new people came in, or the 1994 the Republican Revolution in the House. But what happens is all these new people with bold ideas come in, and all of the committees are controlled by senior members who've been here 15 and 20 years. That's what I found. All the changing Social Security, the things to fix Medicare, the things I came to do, balancing the budget, they were always thwarted by senior members in both parties on committees that were standing for the status quo.
Excuse me, Senator, but I would say that the Tea Party had tremendous sway in the U.S. House because I was there. Let me move on. I think you said in your opening statement that voters favor term limits for judges. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, they do.
So do you think that is a good idea, that we should have term limits for federal judges, including,
I think it's
of course,
something
the Supreme Court?
we should debate and consider. It's not part of of Senator Cruz's amendment, but I know from talking to people around the country, the lifetime appointment for judges is not a very popular idea.
Yeah, I would think so, especially now as we're packing the courts with a lot of judges who have very strong ideological perspectives. You mentioned in other statements that corruption is related to seniority of elected officials. Is that just a feeling from your experience, or is there data that reflects that connection between corruption and seniority?
I think there's a lot of evidence. We certainly have seen senior members of committee, particularly back in the earmark days, where many members were...
Of course, we no longer have earmarks.
That is something that would not have happened if I had not been term limited. I can guarantee you that, because I led the effort in the Senate, and it was very unpopular among senior members and of both parties and of K Street.
Well, actually, I'm asking you if you can cite to any studies or any analysis that points to a connection between corruption and seniority, because I'd like to read those studies.
Well, there are a number of people who've been to jail for corruption, and a lot of those are senior committees, particularly appropriators over the years, and that data is readily available.
I would have to look it up in Google or something. Okay. I mean, I'd really like us to, just as I think all of us share the concern over corruption, of course, and there's a lot of that's happening right now in front of our faces. But be that as it may, I'm not so sure that term limits is the answer. I'm glad that you mentioned that it's not the silver bullet. It's not the be-all and end-all. So speaking of studies, are you familiar with the academic literature, like the work of one of our upcoming witnesses, Professor Linda Powell, which shows us empirically that term limits don't have the effect of cleaning up government or of making it more effective or responsive?
I'm very familiar with it, and I've been a part of those studies looking at term limits at the state level. It's clearly evident that states like California have been able to game the system, while we see states like Florida where they have actually, because of term limits, a lot of positive reforms and education choice, pension reform, keeping their tax rate low, keeping their economy. Of course, I've seen the studies. But states are much smaller. The corruption possibility, the concentration of power is nothing like what it is up here. So I see the arguments for, again, I work on term limits at the state level and I believe in it, but I think the real change would happen if we limited terms in Washington.
We are going to hear from Professor Powell later. So I take it you don't agree with those conclusions in those studies. So did you say that you can cite to evidence that points the other way, that term limits in fact would reduce
A lot of my evidence is
the concerns
experience.
that we are
I was
talking
here,
about?
and I've seen the studies. Again, I've been part of a lot of them. But my conclusion after serving is that term limits would drastically change the incentives and do a lot to reduce corruption and do a whole lot more to get people representing the good of the country, which, again, I think the subject of term limits can come under the title of what do we have to lose. If we look at where this country is right now, I cannot imagine any collection of alternative representatives who could have done our country more of a misservice than the people who've been here the last 3 decades, and I include myself in that number.
Mr. Chairman, I realize I'm about the time that you spent. May I ask just one more question? In my opening statement, I cited to certain things that we could do to make voting much easier, to make sure that our voting systems are not hacked. Do you agree with those items that I cited?
I think we should do everything we can to facilitate the voting of American citizens.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. You know, I would note that in response to the observation about congressional risk aversion, that Senator Hirono pointed to 3 examples she cited of congressional courage. The vote of the Democratic majorities in favor of Obamacare, the vote of the Democratic majorities in favor of amnesty, and the Democrats who voted against the confirmation of Justice Brett Kavanaugh. While those may be examples of courage, those are also examples where those elected officials were voting, number one, consistently with big money special interest here in Washington. But number two, in each of those circumstances, they were voting against the overwhelming interest and views of their constituents, which is why the Obamacare vote produced the Republican takeover of the House of Representatives in 2010. It is why the amnesty vote helped produce the Republican takeover of the Senate in 2014, and it is why the vote against Justice Kavanaugh retired several Democratic members, because in those instances the senators were voting against the views and interests of their constituents. In this instance, with term limits, the overwhelming majority of my constituents, of Senator Hirono's constituents, and everyone else's agree with term limits, and we ought to have the courage to stand and fight for our constituents.
Obviously, we have a disagreement.
Yes.
There you go. What a democracy. Thank you.
Senator Sasse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for scheduling this very important hearing. Senator DeMint, thank you for being here. Thanks for your work on this topic. Thanks also and congratulations for your work on the earmark ban. As has been reported, the Republican conference voted last month to permanently ban earmarks.
I can't believe that.
In 2010, in 2012, 14, and 16, there was an earmark ban, and every year it came back, sort of Frankenstein-like, that the default assumption was at the end of this Congress there should be earmarks again. And so instead of banning them for another 2 years, I led the charge in our conference with an important assist from Senator Cruz, trying to get that earmark ban to be made permanent. But we want to make sure you get lots of credit for the fact that you were one of the first people championing this. So thank you and congratulations.
Thank you for following through.
I think Mr. Smith Goes to Washington would have been an incredibly crappy movie if Jimmy Stewart had stayed around for 100 years, cozied up to K Street and done absolutely everything conceivably possible to keep his job here. And yet there's no way you can tell the really important story about someone coming to fight for something if one of their main calculi, I'm not sure of the Latin, one of the main inputs to the way they think about the question is this going to be popular 12 months or 18 or 24 months from now, as opposed to, is this the right thing to do for my kids and my constituents' kids and grandkids? We need a lot more long-term thinking around here, not short-term finger-in-the-windism. And if we're going to do that, if you're going to drain the swamp, you have to drive a whole bunch of people who are the swamp protectors out of the swamp to go back home. And what we have right now is a whole bunch of people who get elected and decide it's a one-way ticket. People are from where they're from, they run for office, and then once they get to Washington, they buy a permanent home and they eventually stop visiting the home they came from, and they start to have a calculus that staying in Washington forever is a key part of defining their identity and their service. And I think it's pretty obvious that one of the reasons we never tackle entitlement reform around here is because it's obviously the right long-term thing to do, and in the short term, it's going to be really messy to admit the truth that politicians haven't told the truth about the long-term budget, and we've regularly overpromised. And when you come clean with the American people about that, there's going to be a whole bunch of blood on the floor at first when you tell the truth about that. So I would love it if you would itemize a few of the most important topics of legislation that you think we all know we should tackle, and yet short-term political calculus leads everybody to say, well, maybe after the next election.
Thank you, Senator. I recall after the 2010 elections, a number of us wanted to balance the budget. And we picked the debt limit as a fight that we would grant the debt limit increase if we could get legislation to balance the budget over 10 years. We called it cut, cap, and balance. In reality, there was very little cut in spending. It was a slowing of growth over a 10-year period and some economic incentives where the growth actually balanced the budget in 10 years. I was just amazed by my own party that this was such a simple idea after a wave of people had been elected in Tea Party on the Constitution, on balancing the budget, about what about the debt and the bailouts, that the most resistance we had from balancing the budget over a 10-year period was from all the senior members, particularly the appropriators in the Senate, including and especially the Republican leadership. It was just such a good example of a wave of new people who came in with fresh from the campaign trail where they made all these promises and commitments to people, and they came with vision and just love for the country. But everyone told them immediately that their expectations were too high. And that's what this place does to you. It dumbs down your expectation within weeks of getting here. And the nexus of power and reward is all from seniority. The fundraising gets more, the special interests get behind you, and then you have more control of the communications. And if you are trying to cut spending, like if I had to give you one thing, it would be we've got to balance the budget. We cannot keep spending more than we're bringing in. But cutting anything in Washington has so much punishment associated with it by every constituent of every program that no reasonable person is going to keep doing that. You're either going to go home or you're going to get unelected. And so we've got all the incentives in place here to destroy our country. I think one of the only ways to change those incentives is to bring new people up here who know they're going to be here for a short period and they're going to give it everything they've got for their country, and one way or another they're going to go home. But if they're fighting for a lifetime career, they're going to do what all of you have suggested right away, the calculus of what do I have to do to stay here. And it's to do something up here and pretend to be something else back home. That's the game.
Could you unpack, we're almost at time, but could you unpack just a little bit more the distinction you drew between California and Florida? Because there are lots of thoughtful people who oppose term limit legislation. And one of the things they regularly say is that many state capitals have the example of term limits that were passed that actually empowered staff and lobbyists and didn't lead to significant legislative courage and reform. And you drew a distinction between California where they don't, or haven't worked, and Florida where they have. Can you unpack why?
Well, it would be a longer discussion, but California does game the system. It is very controlled by one party. of people who move in and out, but they'll move from one thing to another to an appointed position. And there's someone, I'm sure a lot of people who could explain it better than I, but I have been with legislatures all over the country. And the vibrancy of those legislators who are under term limits, particularly all you have to do is go to an event in Florida. And again, it's not perfect. It doesn't solve all the problems. But they're thinking about what's best for the state now. What can I do now? And they're also thinking how they can bump off some of you guys up here and graduate because they're term limited at the state level. And whether that's healthy or not, I'm not sure. But I do know up here we've got term limit on the Republican side of some committee chairman. We game that system. As soon as they term limit L1, they'll go to be chairman of another committee based on seniority. But the problems at here are very different than the state in that we have, particularly as senators, very large staff. But I've seen as new members come in, they bring in a lot of their own people. The problems are the committees. We need to rotate those staff off periodically. But we can do that. That's not a problem that should keep us from doing something that we know would create a more responsive legislature, a more responsive Congress here. So again, I've heard all the excuses. I've seen the analysis of the different states. Some do it well, some don't. But the bottom line for me, after serving here and looking at all the evidence and direct research as well as anecdotal, is this is one of the most important reforms that we could make.
Thank you. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator DeMint, for being here. I've known you for a long time and admired you from afar, long before I came to know you as a friend and colleague. And I especially appreciate your message today. It reminds me a little bit of a statement that was attributed to St. Augustine during his conversion to Christianity when he said something to the effect of, Lord, grant me chastity and virtue, but not yet. He wanted to wait. It's always easier to wait to do the right thing. It's especially true in Washington. You mentioned a minute ago some of the arguments that are frequently raised in response to the argument for term limits. One of them is that it's not a panacea. It won't solve every problem, as if to suggest that if we can't solve every problem with term limits, we shouldn't try to solve this one. What can you tell us, based on your experience, about how individual members might behave differently if term limits were on the books and they were imposed by the constitutional amendment?
Well, we've talked a lot about it, but if, again, the freedom that comes from being able to act for your constituents and not to act towards getting a future position on a committee or a chairmanship, and most of you know, sitting up there, you rocked the boat your first year up here, which you did. The chances of you going into elected leadership in the conference go down dramatically. It would surprise me. And so, again, if you come up and you want to get to be the prize when I got here was to be a senior member of appropriations. Once the earmarks went away, it was not nearly as desirable of a committee to be on. But to have the seniority means you raise more money. All the lobbyists come to your fundraisers. That creates a ability of you to endear yourself to other members by raising money in your PAC. All of this creates, again, a nexus of power that goes with seniority and that we see with corruption. And if I could just interject, one of my colleagues here just handed me a list of 13 former senior members who have been sent to jail because of bribery or corruption here. This is the American government. This is 13 here. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit these names for the record if I could.
Without objection.
But the evidence is everywhere that seniority, again, protects the status quo. It stops us from solving the huge problems. And then it's the seniority system that allows people to come in and create this new program, because the only bipartisan consensus now in Congress is when you create something new and spend more money. There is never any other bipartisan agreement.
That's well said. I appreciate your insight on that. I also especially appreciated the distinction you drew during your opening testimony between the philosophical arguments for term limits and the practical arguments. It's just interesting to think about the fact that this 230-year-old document is one that has functioned well. It's fostered the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known, and it has done so in part because of the fact that it adequately harnessed human nature. It took into account certain aspects of human nature and pitted one faction against another, one branch of government against another, so that no one person or group of people could get too much power. I think they probably did, as you were alerting to earlier, make the right decision when they had decided initially not to put term limits into the original Constitution. There are some things that have changed since then, or that the Founding Fathers didn't adequately take into account. I suspect that one of them might have been the rise of the dominant two-party system. Another might have been the excessive accumulation of power within Washington, the transfer of as much power from the states to Washington as has happened. And then with that transfer of power, the drive to delegate out the lawmaking power to someone else. Can you speak to that and what the Founding Fathers might have missed?
A lot has changed. I think if we really knew the conditions of those serving in the early Congresses, it would not be necessary to limit terms in the sense of it was not full-time, there was very little pay, there were no retirement programs or thrift savings programs, limited staff, long travel to get here. It was certainly a sacrifice. So folks needed to have other jobs back home, farms or whatever, to make things work. There wasn't quite the danger. But now the allure here in Washington is quite different, that you can make it a full-time career with decent retirement and a post-congressional career that can be very lucrative. Lots of staff, again, it's a very different situation. And the money in politics, and I think as you alluded to, Senator Lee, is the power that has convened here in Washington, D.C. from all over the world. It's here because of the concentration of political power. Now we have the concentration of economic power, concentration of media power, and all of that really comes back to the real powers and the seniority within these walls. And we can't fix it with one fell swoop, but we can sure break up a lot of it and change the incentives in a hurry.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator DeMint. One final question. You testified about how public opinion supports term limits 80-20, and this is across racial lines, across ethnic lines, across party lines, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. When you brought forward your resolution in support of term limits before the Senate, it was voted down 75-24. Do you know of another issue on which the views of Congress are so wildly out of step? The American people supported 80-20, and yet the Senate votes it down 75-24 on the opposite side. Do you know of another issue in which the views are so wildly out of step, and why is it that career politicians in both parties are defying the will of their constituents?
It's a great question, and again, it's still a great issue to run on, but a lot of the money now, even when you're running for office, is not going to be there if you limit your term. I was told that when I ran for Senate, that a lot of the big PACs are not going to give to you if you limit your term because they don't want to invest in someone who's not going to be there very long. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your initiative on this issue, and I hope it will get some open and honest debate.
Very good. Thank you, Senator DeMint. We'll call up the second panel and proceed immediately to the second panel.
Well, while we're waiting for the second panel, you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, how many other issues do the American people support by a wide margin? Yes, they support gun legislation, they support abortion. We're not doing anything about those either in the Senate. Try to get rid of it.
Well,
Anyway, rather than getting into a big
well, no. Senator Hirono, if you're going to make a statement, I'll at least respond with the facts. The overwhelming majority of Americans support the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And when it comes to abortion, the current position of the modern Democratic Party, which supports unlimited abortion on demand, partial birth abortion up until the moment of birth, with taxpayer funding and no parental notification and consent, 9% of Americans agree with the position of today's Democratic Party. That is an extreme and out-of-step position.
I disagree. There are facts to support why I disagree. Okay, second panel.
Pleased to introduce 4 witnesses on our second panel. Mr. Nick Tombolatus is the Executive Director of U.S. Term Limits, one of the nation's leading advocacy groups in favor of term limits. Under his leadership, U.S. Term Limits launched the Term Limits Convention, a campaign to obtain a constitutional amendment for term limits via Convention of the States. Nick is a graduate of the University of Connecticut and currently resides in Melbourne, Florida with his family. Our second witness is Professor Linda W. Powell. Professor Powell is a professor of political science at the University of Rochester, where she teaches primarily courses on American politics. Her work has won the Fenno Prize, the Best Book Award of the Legislative Studis section of the American Political Science Association, and the Gray Prize, the Best Book Award of the State Politics and Policy section of the APSA. Among her many publications, she has authored or co-authored work related to the effects of term limits at the state level. Professor Powell received her PhD in American politics from the University of Rochester. Our third witness is Professor John D. Rausch. Professor Rausch is the Teal Bivens Professor of Political Science at West Texas A&M University near Amarillo, Texas. Professor Rausch has conducted extensive research into term limits and the effects of term limits in particular at the state level. He has also written or contributed to numerous books and published articles, including the Texas edition of a leading American government textbook, Government in America, People, Politics, and Policy. Professor Rausch received his BA from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks and his MA and PhD from the University of Oklahoma, where he wrote his dissertation on term limits. And our final witness is Mr. Casey Burgat. Mr. Burgat is a senior fellow of the Governance Project of the R Street Institute, where he researches and writes about congressional capacity and ways to make Congress function better. He previously worked at the Congressional Research Service, where he served in the executive branch operations and the Congress and Judiciary sections. Mr. Burgat holds a BA in Political Science from Arizona State University, a Master's in Political Management from George Washington University, and received his PhD in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland, where his dissertation focused on the impacts of congressional staff. Our first witness, Mr. Tombolatus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senators, for providing me an opportunity to address this important issue. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are an employer and you've got some problems with your employees. When you hired these employees, they promised they would do exactly what you asked of them. But once they got the job, they became a nightmare. They stopped listening to you and started using the job to line their own pockets. They took the company credit card and racked up more debt than you could afford to pay back. They became so obsessed with keeping their jobs that they forgot to do their jobs. And after all that failure, all that disappointment, and all that incompetence, your employees came to you and said, "We deserve a raise." If you're a reasonable person, that should make your blood boil. And yet, that is exactly what it feels like to be an American taxpayer. The first 3 words in our Constitution are "we the people." It's written larger than anything else because the framers of that document, the architects of our republic, wanted to remind you at all times who's in charge. We, the people. We are your employers, and you have an obligation to listen to us. So I come to you with a message from the American people. We demand term limits for members of Congress. In fact, according to the most recent national polls on the issue, 82% of Americans want term limits. That includes support from 89% of Republicans, 76% of Democrats, and 83% of independent voters. This is not a left or right issue. This is an American issue. In fact, term limits could be the only issue with support from both President Trump and former President Obama. Now, there was a time about 25 years ago when Congress was debating this. Nearly every opponent of term limits up here had the same rebuttal: experience, experience, experience. We need experience to do this job right. If only you leave your Congress member in office for decades on end, he or she will become such a policy expert that all our problems will be solved. In hindsight, that was one of the worst predictions ever. This system is broken. Congress has given us $22 trillion in debt, the longest war in American history, a broken healthcare system, a broken immigration system, a tax code written by lobbyists, an explosion of money in politics. Worst of all, too few here have the courage to address these problems because the only focus is on getting reelected. That's why it comes as no surprise that Congress has a 14% approval rating, and 60% of Americans say that they would fire every single member of Congress if they could. Congress is less popular than traffic jams, root canals, and hemorrhoids. You're beating head lice, but the lice have asked for a recount. Unfortunately, elections alone cannot fix this problem. Not because voters like you guys so much, but due to the nearly unbreakable power of incumbency. At the same time members of Congress publicly claim elections are free and fair, they secretly deploy every trick in the book to keep power. Incumbents get $9 in special interest money for every dollar that goes to a challenger. And if incumbents are having difficulty raising money, not to worry, they're allowed to send campaign-style mailers at taxpayer expense. That's to say nothing of all the free media and name recognition politicians naturally get just for being in office. The incumbent advantage creates a barrier to entry for everyday Americans without the connections to fund a campaign. It is the case for term limits. Elections may, in theory, be capable of dethroning incumbents, but that isn't how it works in the real world. Congressional incumbents have a 98% re-election rate. That probably explains why Congress looks more like a country club than a melting pot. It's predominantly made up of lawyers and politicians, and is disproportionately old, white, rich, and male. Term limits would give us a legislature that better reflects the diversity of our society. The message long-term incumbents send to young people like me seems to be, we want you just close enough to the political process to help us win, but don't get too close and take our jobs. The American people have lost confidence in this Congress, and for good reason. We routinely see abuses of power. 18 months ago, it was revealed that members of Congress were secretly using taxpayer money to settle lawsuits, some for sexual harassment. You still haven't disclosed how our money was spent and on whose behalf. So term limits is a check on arrogance, it's a check on incumbency, and it's a check on power. It's a way to restore political courage while bringing fresh faces and ideas to Washington. As Ben Franklin said, for the rulers to return among the people was not to degrade them, but to promote them. As Kanye West said, no one man should have all that power. Here's the dilemma we face. Over 80% of Americans want term limits to happen. Donald Trump and Barack Obama want it. It is being blocked purely by the self-interest of Congress. If this were a trial, you all would have to recuse yourselves because there is a colossal conflict of interest. If term limits pass, you won't stay in the limelight forever. You won't be the center of attention, and some people might even stop laughing at your jokes. You'll have to become ordinary citizens. And that is, my friends, the entire point. We're asking you to do what's right and listen to the people you represent. It's time to bring the gravy train into the station, end the reign of career politicians, and give Congress back to the people. Please support Senate Joint Resolution 1 for term limits. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Powell.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Hirono, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the findings of my academic research on term limits, which I began to study in 1995. My relevant publications, co-authors, funding sources, and methods are detailed in my written comments. Between 1990 and 1995, 21 states adopted legislative term limits, and 15 still have them today. The large number of states that adopted term limits in this short period of time presented political scientists with a rare opportunity to study the effects of a major institutional change. My findings are based on interviews with legislators, 2 national surveys of legislators, and hard data on their elections, constituencies, and so forth. The surveys allowed us to compare 4 categories of legislators: newcomers and old-timers, each in term-limited and in non-term limited legislatures. The primary studies were conducted at 2 points in time, one after the adoption of term limits, but before implementation, that is, before any legislators are actually termed out, and the other after implementation. The legislative careerism that is curtailed by term limits was widely expected to alter the types of individuals who sought and won office. Notably, there is no support for term limits significantly increasing the proportion of citizen legislators rather than career-oriented politicians. Term-limited newcomers in the study after implementation were more likely to have held other elective prior office than were non-term limited newcomers. Legislators in states with term limits professed equally strong career ambitions, but to continue their political careers, they needed to run for other office. For example, members in term-limited lower chambers much more often said they were likely to run for state senates than were members in non-term-limited chambers. Term limits were similarly expected by many to bring in new faces with fresh ideas, yet there were no differences in demographic composition between term-limited newcomers and other newcomers. We examined member education, income, age, race, gender, occupation, ideology, and ideological extremism. The adoption of term limits did have an immediate effect on legislative behavior. For example, it was argued that term limits would reduce the incentive to spend time building constituency support for re-election. We expected and we found that members in term-limited chambers spent less time on keeping in touch with their constituents, on casework, and on pork. These differences were more pronounced for legislators in chambers in the implementation stage of term limits where members are actually being termed out of office. There was, however, no difference between term-limited and non-term limited chambers in time spent on campaigning and fundraising. The strongest findings involved institutional effects. When term limits are implemented in legislatures, governors, as well as bureaucrats and civil servants, gain considerable influence at the expense of legislatures. The fact that the effect is delayed until limits actually kick in suggests the effect is a product of the removal of long-term incumbents rather than of changing incentives that arise from putting term limits on the books. Within chambers, most of the decline in the power of majority party leaders occurs immediately after the adoption of term limits, with only a modest further decline after implementation. In contrast, the influence of committee chairs begins to decline when term limits are adopted, but declines much more later when they are implemented. These results would be consistent with the notion that the authority of speakers and majority leaders is based on control over rewards and sanctions to rank and file legislators, whereas the influence of committee chairs is based on deference to their policy expertise. Thus, term limits immediately undercut the chamber leader's authority by voiding expectations about future ability to reward and sanction. The committee chair's authority declines when the chair, the expert, leaves. Much of my recent research has focused on term limits as explanatory factors in projects on other topics. One project on the legislative influence of campaign contributions found that contributions in term-limited legislatures have the same or perhaps slightly less influence than in non-term limited legislatures. Another recent project has sought to understand how legislators come to agreements on difficult issues. In the interviews that I conducted, legislators mentioned term limits as reducing the time they had to build the personal relationships with other legislators that facilitate reaching agreements. The effects of institutional change, such as term limits, are complex and hard to fully anticipate in advance. Although we are still unraveling the nuances of term limits, I think we have a very good understanding of the main effects. Here I've just outlined my findings. I'd be glad to discuss, and with some examples, any of them, particularly careerism and campaign contributions. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Rausch.
I'd like to thank the subcommittee for allowing me the time to talk a little bit about my experiences with term limits. My name is Dr. Dave Rausch, and I'm the Teal Bivens Professor of Political Science at West Texas A&M University in Canyon, Texas. The ideas and opinions expressed in this statement are mine alone and not those of West Texas A&M or the Texas A&M University system. I've been studying term limits for about 30 years. In August 1989, I started graduate school in political science at the University of Oklahoma. I was fortunate to be a graduate fellow at the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center. That fall, Oklahoma businessman Lloyd Noble began the process that led to Oklahoma enacting the nation's first state legislative term limits in September of 1990. I've studied term limits for so many years that a graduate colleague regularly tells others that there should be term limits on people who study term limits. My dissertation looks at the first years of the state legislative term limit phenomenon. Notice I did not say movement, because I have a different perspective on what a movement is versus a phenomenon. I combined a careful review of the news media in the states that enacted term limits from 1990 to 1995 with interviews of those term limit leaders. I also published a number of research articles looking at the effects of term limits on electoral competition in Oklahoma. While attending a training session in 1991, I learned about the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors in California. Voters in San Mateo County enacted term limits on the Board of Supervisors, which is a legislative executive body, in 1980. By 1992, the first supervisor would be termed out of office. So in an article, I report that the most significant effect of term limits in San Mateo County was that supervisor who was about to be termed out spent a lot of time looking for other offices to run for. My research suggests that term limits have not had all of the positive effects predicted by supporters, but also that they have not had all of the negative consequences. So being a good social scientist, I come square down the middle. I'm neither happy or sad in this case. Since 2000, I've been collecting data, some media reports, and other published political science research on both Oklahoma and San Mateo County to expand my research over that 30 to 40 years worth of experience with term limits. By 2020, the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors will have conducted county business under term limits for 40 years, while the Oklahoma legislature will have experienced term limits for 30 years. Such research should provide insights into the positive and negative effects of term limits on legislative bodies. The enactment of term limits, as my colleague has already pointed out, has been a boon to research on state legislatures. Much of the new research examines any changes wrought by term limits by looking at the new relationships between legislatures and constituents, the dynamics of legislative leadership, and the effects on legislative demographics, so diversity. The most powerful research seeks to understand how term limits affect the work of legislatures with the other branches of state government. A lot of the changes that have been found in California, we talked a little bit about that. There's a research project that found that while political careerism continues, members of the legislature look for other offices, that the number of female minority representatives actually increased in the California legislature, but that the legislature was less likely to challenge the governor on his budget. Research has examined more specific questions. In Oklahoma, for example, Oklahoma legislators seem to be serving longer after term limits were enacted than before term limits were enacted. But it's such a small difference of about 1.5 to 2 years in office. We also take a look at what's called the last term effect. What happens to a legislator, or in this case, a member of Congress, in their last term? And most of the research has found that there's really no significant difference in the activities. They're either not enacting or not introducing as much legislation, or they're introducing less legislation and focusing on quality versus quantity in their last term. Probably the best source, if you're looking for information, is a really thick book that looks specifically at the state of Michigan by Sarbaugh, Thompson, and Thompson. They actually looked at term limits for 13 years, interviewed about 460 members of the state legislature and other observers, and they essentially found that the legislature has become less accessible to the executive branch, which is very interesting. And they've also found that there is a bigger gap now between the legislature and their constituents. Political science needs to better understand how legislative term limits change the status and work of state legislatures. Does the length of the limits make a difference? It's interesting how we seem to be kind of holding on 6 and 12 when maybe one term in each body might be an appropriate number. That might make it a much more accountable body. I'd like to be able to determine that one term limit that best amplifies the positive effects of term limits while maintaining the delicate balance between the three branches of government. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Burgat.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Hirono, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify this afternoon. My name is Casey Burgat, and I'm a Senior Governance Fellow at the R Street Institute, where it is my job to identify, study, and write on potential reforms Congress might adopt to reassert itself as the first branch of government. One commonly advanced reform is limiting by constitutional amendment the number of terms members of Congress can serve. It is my goal today to discuss the very real downsides that would result from the implementation of such term limits. But first, believe me when I say this is a bit of an uncomfortable position, and because I understand completely why term limits are so incredibly popular with the American public. As you know better than most, Congress isn't very popular. We got a list of reasons of things that you lose out to today. Voters feel unheard by the very officials they choose to be their voice. Instead, they see craven career politicians out for themselves. They feel drowned out by the moneyed special interests and the swampy ways of doing business. They feel unrepresented by their representatives. It follows then that if we limit the number of terms a member can serve, perhaps we can stem the corruptive tides that are assumed to inevitably creep and to even the best-intentioned lawmakers. They really do make sense on the surface. But term limits may be great politics, but they are incredibly bad for governing. In fact, they are far more likely to hamper Congress's ability to do its job and would exacerbate some of the very problems their adoption is intended to rectify. Allow me to turn to specifics. Proponents of term limits, as we've heard today, argue that their implementation would accomplish two primary objectives. First, they suggest they would eliminate career politicians who, because of their incumbency advantages, have little incentive to remain responsive to their constituents. Term limits, advocates suggest, would increase diversity in Congress and return it to the citizen legislature that many feel the framers intended. And second, they argue that they would decrease member reliance on special interest groups and big money donors, since lawmakers would feel less compelled to court their support to remain in office. Experience with term limits at the state level, because that's all we have since it's never been adopted at the federal level, have shown us that neither of these objectives would be accomplished. When comparing the makeup of legislatures in term-limited and non-term limited states, researchers, particularly Dr. Powell, 2 chairs down, found no meaningful differences across a host of variables, including occupation, family income, age, race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, or candidate ideology. Plus, term-limited legislatures reveal equally strong ambitions to remain in other elected offices, a finding at odds with the assumption that term limits would produce officials willing to ditch politics and government and return to the private sector. More important, however, studies show that once the electoral connection is severed, once we remove the mechanism of elections, term-limited legislators are actually less, not more, concerned with the needs of their constituents and individual districts. Term-limited lawmakers have been found to spend less time personally keeping in touch with their constituents, engage in less constituent service, exert less energy developing policy solutions, and are less likely to show up for votes, and importantly, less likely to engage in oversight. Turning to the second point, that term limits make legislators less beholden to special interests, we find that once term limits are adopted, lawmakers are more, not less likely to defer to outside actors of the chamber, including lobbyists, bureaucrats, governors, and even long-serving legislative staff. This deference outside the chamber is wholly predictable. Lawmakers and their staffs do not have the time nor informational capacity to main expertise on all the issues for which they're responsible. So they do what any of us do when we don't have the answer. We Google it, as Ranking Member Hirono suggested earlier, or we ask someone else for help. In practice, this means that they turn to sources such as well-resourced lobbying shops and executive agencies who maintain that in-house expertise. In either case, the legislature and its lawmakers become dependent on unelected outsiders for information that often comes with a partisan agenda. Finally, term limits take away from voters the fundamental right to choose their representatives. Term limits automatically kick out lawmakers without regard for how supported they are by their constituents. Term limits have proven to be a brain drain on legislatures, decreasing their capacity to perform the duties as a co-equal branch of government. Lawmaking is incredibly difficult, and a task where even the most seasoned, experienced lawmakers struggle to fully anticipate the unintended consequences of each vote they take. It's unhelpful and inaccurate to portray experience in government as a negative rather than a public benefit. Just as in any other profession, from teaching to accounting to surgery, we get better at the job the longer we do the job. Could we do better at holding members accountable? Absolutely, we could. But neither Congress's job performance nor the public's dissatisfaction with its work will be improved by automatically forcing out duly elected, experienced members. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you. Mr. Tombolatus, your organization, U.S. Term Limits, has been one of the major groups supporting term limits for Congress since the 1990s. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about how your group got started and how it got involved in the term limits movement?
Term limits is basically the largest grassroots movement in the history of our country. This has never been a politician-driven enterprise. In fact, politicians don't like term limits. That's why I think it's such a good idea. But this was basically started in a small group of people across several states in the early 1990s. Were just dissatisfied with the quality of government that they were getting at the state level and from Congress. They had looked at presidential term limits, which were ratified into the Constitution in 1951, and said, this has served our country well. This has struck a good balance between getting a fresh face in office, without allowing them to become too stale. And so they developed the concept for legislative term limits at the state level and congressional term limits. It went to the ballot in 23 states, and it was passed in all 23 states with an average yes vote of 70%, without any help from the political class. So that's basically how it got started. We formed an organization around this to continue promoting the effort because largely, despite some of what you've heard today, term limits in the states have worked very well. States with term limits actually have the most competitive elections in the country. That's the chief aim of term limits, to make elections more competitive. The state with the tightest term limits, Michigan, is the only state in the country with 100% of its elections contested. And as for the idea that political experience is more valuable than real-world experience, that's not what we see happening at the state level. Among rankings of states by fiscal health, the states with term limits tend to be clustered toward the top, and the states run by career politicians are pretty much at the bottom. I live in Florida. We were ranked #1 in fiscal health for, I think, 3 consecutive years. We just dropped down to 3 or 4, but it's okay. We were beaten by 2 other term limit states. So the results at the state level have really borne fruit, and I think it would have an even bigger impact here in Congress because the political class is even more entrenched.
You know, one of the benefits of term limits, I believe, is increasing the diversity of representation. Back in 1995, Edward H. Crane testified to this committee that term limits would increase the number and diversity of Americans choosing to run for Congress. And Dr. Rausch, you testified in particular that in California, term limits probably speeded up the increase in female and minority representation. That's correct. And your testimony also cites an article by Samantha Petty that finds that women are more likely to successfully run for the state legislature in states with term limits. Can you tell us a little bit more about that conclusion?
I can. There's really an interesting point to that conclusion. I mean, I would give you the actual percentages, but I didn't memorize them. But it's interesting that she did find that and we find this in other elections as well, typically in an open seat election, if it's between a male candidate and a female candidate, in an open seat election, the female candidate has a better chance of winning than in a female running against an incumbent. What she found that was particularly interesting and maybe more relevant to our discussion today is that it tended to favor Democratic women versus Republican women. That in an open seat election where the Republican woman was running against a Democratic male, in an open seat, the Democratic male was going to win. So it's a sort of a double-edged sword, but definitely it does show that in an open seat election, women tend to run and tend to win more often.
Well, and I guess it's my understanding that Dr. Petty's paper also says, quote, this pattern of women running and prevailing more often holds for both Republican and Democratic female candidates.
I'll have to go back and reread it, but the summary that I saw showed that she took the article and she made a blog entry at the London School of Economics. They have an interesting blog, and maybe she misspoke or summarized her own article, which I can't believe, but she suggested that it does, and maybe she also looked at additional elections too, that it really favors more Democratic women than it does Republican women. Now, also, we need to look to see how many Republican women run. It might be the other question.
Without objection, we'll enter her full article into the record.
Sure.
It'll be part of this committee hearings record. Mr. Tombolatus, in your experience, why is there such overwhelming popular support for term limits, and why does it cut across party lines? Why does it include not just Republicans, but independents and Democrats? If, in fact, Dr. Rausch just testified that term limits produces more women and more minorities in office, why do you see such overwhelming support?
I think we see such overwhelming and bipartisan support because the American people have largely concluded that powerful incumbents in both parties are basically colluding against them to keep newcomers, to keep fresh faces and ideas out of the political process. And I think that's also leading to a lot of voter apathy in our country. Senator Hirono mentioned earlier finding ways to get more people involved in politics. If elections are a foregone conclusion and 98% of incumbents are going to get returned to office every 2 years, I think it's a very fair question to ask, what's the point? When you have term limits, you are guaranteed a competitive open seat election on a regular basis. Voters are guaranteed more options at the ballot box. It's more exciting, it's more in line with what our framers envisioned for how this country should really work. I also think there's record levels of frustration with Washington, D.C. You know, we're now in several decades of an experiment with professional politicians, and by any objective standard, it has failed. Things have gotten much worse here, not better.
Thank you. Senator Hirono.
Thank you. Let me ask you, Mr. Tombolatus. I noted some other ways that we can encourage more voter participation, which you just cited as a good thing. Do you support making voting easier in the United States, not harder?
Absolutely, Senator.
Do you support making voter registration as simple as possible?
I do, yeah, depending on the details of that proposal.
Well, assuming that they're all citizens and all that. Do you support stopping unnecessary and discriminatory purging of voters?
Absolutely.
Do you support making it easier for people to vote early or allow them to vote by mail?
I would have to see the specifics of the proposal to give you an answer on that. I'd say not all early voting proposals are created equal.
Well, we won't get into why all of that. I just want to go down this
sure.
list. So would you condemn discriminatory voter ID laws?
I'm admittedly not an expert in voter ID laws, so I'm not going to take a position on that right now. I'd have to do more research into that topic. Term limits is more my bailiwick.
Well, would you, but it is your bailiwick that you would like to see more voters
Correct.
participate. So would you condemn a discriminatory voter ID laws, for example, that identifies the kind of IDs that blacks usually have, that identifies the kind of IDs that students have, and then the voter ID law would specifically require different kinds of IDs for these two groups of voters? Would you condemn that kind of law?
Senator, I unequivocally condemn all forms of discrimination against all groups, regardless.
So it sounds like you would condemn that kind of a voter ID law.
If that were indeed the law, yes.
Yes, that is indeed the concept for underlying a lot of the voter ID laws. Would you condemn partisan gerrymandering?
Absolutely.
Do you think we should enact a law to reverse the Shelby County decision that eviscerated the Voting Rights Act?
I'm not 100% familiar with that specific decision.
It did eviscerate the Voting Rights Act. Do you think we should counter election fraud, such as what we saw in North Carolina?
Senator, I think in debating the merits of a proposal for congressional term limits, while there may be other ideas out there that also have merit, that does not obviate the need to impose term limits on Congress. I mean, 82% of Americans want term limits on Congress, and I believe that's the reason why we're here today.
There are a huge percentage of American people who also support a lot of other things that Congress is not addressing. So these are other suggestions and proposals that I'd just like to have you on the record as to whether you support it or not. Do you support ensuring election security?
Yes, Senator.
Let's see, I want to ask Professor Powell. So I asked Mr. Tombolatus just now, I went down a list. What are your thoughts on some of the other more effective ways of achieving the goal of less corrupt, more transparent, and more responsive government? And it could include the items that I just asked Mr. Tombolatus about.
I think it would include the items that you asked him about, and one that I would argue too, is I've studied campaign finance for a long period of time, and when I've interviewed both Republican and Democratic legislators individually, they're very concerned about the rise of independent spending.
Certainly.
And I would think that that would be an additional one to add to your
Yes,
list.
whether or not to undo Citizens United.
Yes.
Yes, well, I would agree with that. So the list of things, and you would add the problem with all the dark money and the unlimited amount of spending that candidates can now engage in as a result of a couple of decisions, most recently Citizens United.
Very much so. I interviewed one legislator in a term-limited state, and he was the leader of the Senate in that state, a Republican, quite conservative. And he said, I believe in the First Amendment, but we have to do something about independent spending. He said that we go home to small towns, we live in small communities. These ads are uniformly negative. They hurt our families and our friends. And it makes it very difficult to come back to Congress and work with the other side that we know has orchestrated these ads.
So perhaps this committee or another relevant committee could have a hearing on the corrupting impact of unlimited spending. You know, one of the things that can happen with term limits is that people have to run for other offices. And I believe that in a lot of term-limited states, members who are term-limited simply run for another public office. Is that what your research shows?
Yes, it does very much. And I can read you a quote or two, which I think kind of exemplifies this. In California, which we've discussed, which is the most professionalized legislature and most similar to the Congress, an assemblyman said, I think a lot of people thought term limits were going to bring in your basic citizen legislator who was going to want to serve for a couple terms and then go back to whatever he was doing before. And that's just completely wrong. Most people walk in, and the first day they walk in the door, they can tell you what Senate seat they're running for, because I'm nested with a guy whose Senate seat is expiring this year. I'm going to go to Congress in this year. Look, people who want to do this kind of stuff are professionally oriented and want to make it a profession.
So, Dr. Powell, we're told that Michigan is a very successful term limit state. Does this kind of a revolving door for elected office, does that not happen in Michigan?
It absolutely does. So one of my colleagues alluded to the study that was done in Michigan by Sarbar, Thompson, and Thompson. And they studied it through 2010. So they've studied it a period when term limits have reached equilibrium, or they've matured. And what they concluded was tenure in office does not appear to sate legislators' ambition, and legislators attracted to serve after term limits are more, not less, politically ambitious. This increase in political ambition is the most distinctive characteristic of the new breed of term-limited legislators. Most of them do not aspire to be citizen legislators. On the contrary, they seek a career in politics, and they arrive in the state capitol with plans for how to accomplish this. This fundamentally alters Michigan's legislature, making it into a springboard that elected representatives use to reach the next rung on the ladder. And there also is a concern on careerism that I could address if you'd like, about other kinds of occupations.
No, if the chairman will permit, because I'm out of time.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So the other thing that I think is a concern is that legislators naturally are concerned about when they leave Congress, what are they going to do? How are they getting the money to send their kids to college, to fund their retirement, and so forth? Mm-hmm. And many of them find that other careers are more lucrative than the ones that they held before they first held elective office. And one of the interviews that we had was in California. It was the president of the California Senate, President Lockyer. And he said before term limits, the bulk of senators would have been happy to continue to serve in the Senate for the foreseeable future. Now, many look at statewide office. A few retire, but not many. Some want to lobby or other things. One of the distressing things you see, excuse me, is when a chair, and this goes back to the assembly, not to our chamber, but a chair of a powerful committee a year and a half ahead of departure due to term limits is meeting with the executives of that industry to try to secure employment for when the term ends. That kind of thing is bothersome. And we asked, is that something that's fairly widespread? And he said, no, but it's happened. Mostly, probably, they don't tell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, and I will note that problem you're highlighting was recently underscored by a report that showed of the exiting members of Congress from the last Congress, I believe in excess of 60% of them went to become lobbyists. That in turn prompted Democratic freshman House member Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to tweet out to the world that she favored a lifetime ban on former members of Congress becoming lobbyists, to which I promptly retweeted and said, I agree, let's work together. That had some interesting reactions in the Twitter world, but I have long advocated a lifetime ban for members of Congress becoming lobbyists for the same reason that I support term limits, because both are ways to address the culture of corruption, bipartisan corruption in Washington.
We finally agree. It's a really positive way to end this hearing.
Well, that is a fabulous thing, we are working actually with Representative Ocasio-Cortez. We'll see if we have bipartisan legislation on that, but that would be good. Let me ask Mr. Tombolatus a final question. So, the amendment I've introduced to impose congressional term limits, as I mentioned, it has 14 co-sponsors. As I was looking down the list of co-sponsors, two things stand out. Number one, every single one of those co-sponsors was elected in 2010 or more recently. In other words, not a single co-sponsor of the amendment was elected prior to 2010. And number two, sadly, of the 14 co-sponsors, none of them are Democrats. Now, you've testified roughly 70% of Democratic voters support term limits, and yet 0 Democratic senators are supporting a constitutional term limits amendment. Why do you think it is that none of the senators elected before 2010 are willing to support this policy that the overwhelming majority of the American people want, and that none of the Democratic senators are willing to support this policy that the overwhelming majority of Democratic voters want?
So I can't go entirely into their motivations, but I can imagine for those who were elected before 2010, there is some feeling that they may be viewed as hypocrites if they were to co-sponsor this legislation. And that might be a mistaken understanding of the legislation itself. There are two forms of term limits out there. There's the self-term limit, when someone runs for Congress and says, I will voluntarily step down over a certain number of terms. And then there are constitutional term limits. That is what SJR 1, your amendment, aims to tackle. A constitutional term limit would apply this term limit across the board to every member of Congress. And there should really be no compunction among more senior members over supporting something like that, because they were elected under a different system. They know seniority is the currency here in Washington, D.C., and no one should begrudge them using that currency to its fullest advantage. But what we're saying is we want to dramatically overhaul the incentives in this place and create an atmosphere of competition and political courage that simply did not exist before. With respect to Democrats, I don't know precisely why they're not supporting it to a greater extent, but I do say that term limits are very consistent with Democratic ideals of making elections more fair. Right now, the cost of unseating a House incumbent is pegged at $2.5 million by the Center for Responsive Politics. If you have less than $1 million to your name, your odds of winning a seat in Congress over an incumbent are 2 in 293. So the deck
Just repeat that last sentence.
Yeah, if you have less than $1 million in your campaign account, your odds of unseating a House incumbent are 2 in 293.
Wow.
According to OpenSecrets.org, Center for Responsive Politics. So incumbents have essentially rigged the system. They have stacked the deck against outsiders. Congress is a career political class, primarily of lawyers and lifelong politicians, and we're not getting the diversity that our country deserves. Where are the teachers serving in Congress? Where are the doctors? Where are the firefighters? Where are the nurses? I mean, if we had term limits, we would get a true citizen legislature that reflects what our country looks like.
See, the thing is that we share concerns about corruption, undue influence, all of that. But I think that a lot of Democrats recognize that term limits will not do the job. And in fact, it is the Democrats who support changing the campaign spending laws so that it doesn't take $1 million, or to change all of the, to prevent the kind of gerrymandering, to prevent the kind of voter suppression laws that are being enacted across the states in a pretty fast clip, especially after the Shelby County decision. So there are many ways to get at this concern that we all share. The thing is, though, that term limits on the legislators will simply make the executive and others that much more powerful, and I think that really goes to the balance of power, delicate balance of power that Dr. Rausch talked about, and that I think the panelists recognize. I think we all recognize that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, and I will say it is unfortunate that Senate Democrats are perfectly willing to focus on what are partisan election policies, such as, for example, opposing photo ID laws for voting. Again, the overwhelming majority of Americans support photo ID laws for voting. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, upheld Indiana's photo ID laws for voting, and Justice John Paul Stevens, one of the most renowned liberals on the U.S. Supreme Court, writing in the Crawford case, the Indiana case, said that those photo ID laws protect the integrity of the democratic process. But unfortunately, today's national Democratic party politics opposes common sense photo ID laws that protect the rights of voters who often see their votes stolen or at risk of being stolen, including often minority voters, Hispanic voters, African American voters, who can be the subject of unscrupulous voter fraud. And rather than focusing on an issue which is a pure Democratic partisan issue, I do wish that some Democrats in the Senate were willing to actually take on career politicians in both parties. 70% of Democratic voters want term limits. The American people are right on this, and I wish that our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle in the Senate would listen to their own constituents.
I could say more about that.
I want to thank each of the witnesses for coming and testifying today. Your testimony was helpful. And the record will remain open in this matter for 2 weeks. Any senators are asked to submit questions within the next 2 weeks to witnesses, and the witnesses are asked to promptly respond to those questions in writing. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.